Hello and welcome to Talk of Today, where we explore developments in science, technology, and society, and what they could mean for the future. I'm your host, Sam Barton. In this episode, I am once again joined by the philosopher and economist Professor Karl Widerquist. He's a professor of philosophy at Georgetown University in Qatar, and he was also the co-founder of the US Basic Income Guarantee Network, which was the first basic income network in the United States, and was also co-chair of the Basic Income Earth Network from 2008 to 2017. Karl is best known for his ardent support of a universal basic income, which is an unconditional payment to all citizens sufficient to cover basic needs. The core of his work is focused on justifying a universal basic income from the perspectives of property rights and freedom. His defense of this social program, that has support from both sides of the political spectrum, can be summed up as the power to say no, which we explore a bit in our conversation. He has recently co-authored several books, two of which served as the basis of this discussion. These are The Prehistory of Private Property, which debunks 3 false claims commonly accepted by contemporary political philosophers regarding property systems, and the book Prehistoric Myths in Modern Political Philosophy, which explores how philosophers use and perpetuate myths about prehistory. While there's barely any mention of universal basic income in these texts, the conclusions that lead from them can be seen to be strongly in support of a social program like a universal basic income. I've been excited about the idea of a universal basic income since I first learned of it, not only for its potential in alleviating poverty and suffering, but also because I can see it leading to an explosion of creativity, new innovations in businesses, as well as provide people with the freedom and time to pursue other forms of social change, which we are quite obviously in desperate need of around the world. It was great to catch up with Karl again, and I hope you enjoy our conversation as well. Anyway, let's get into it. Here is my conversation with Professor Karl Widerquist. So I know we spoke a couple of years ago, and I was thrilled to have the chance to speak to you then. And I'm I'm very happy to have you on to follow up and to talk about universal basic income and some of the work you've been up to. But before we dive into all of that, I would just love to hear how you came to become a philosopher. How did you come to be a big supporter of universal basic income and an advocate for, over the past few decades?
Well, politics and ethics were a big subject around the dinner table at my house when I was growing up. My dad was a Presbyterian minister, not the kind you have in Northern Ireland, but the more cerebral kind you have in the United States. And it was the 1970s and early 80s. It was a lot of political issues going around. My parents were very concerned with building a more just society. They took the caring aspects of Christianity way more seriously than a lot of other people, a lot of other Christians, and they took the really judgmental, those people are bad sort of aspects of Christianity. That wasn't their thing. So we talked about right and wrong a lot, and we would argue about politics and things like that, and had a strong sense that morality is very important and not that easy to figure out what is the right thing to do in a lot of occasions, and that our society is unjust, and it's our job to create a just society. And I thought we'd taken a big step forward with the civil rights movement, which appeared to be over to a white child at that time living in an integrated town. It appeared like, oh well, we won that one. Now we got to tackle poverty. That's the biggest injustice left. And I'm like, okay, well, we haven't actually fixed that one yet. But poverty is a huge injustice, both locally and worldwide. And so that was a concern of mine. And then on my 15th birthday, I saw Milton Friedman's I was watching Milton Friedman's television show called Free to Choose. He has this book, Free to Choose, and he had a PBS television show, that's public broadcasting in the United States, where they had one episode for each chapter of his book. And maybe it's embarrassing to say how influenced I was by Milton Friedman, because I'm really not a fan of his anymore. But the episode that happened to air on my 15th birthday, February 7th, 1980, was about the guaranteed income. And I was convinced. And I've been really convinced of it ever since. My view of it has changed, and why I think it's important has changed. But I was convinced from that day at 15. So I've supported basic income for over 40 years. But of course, I was in high school at the time, so I had to go to high school and college. I worked for a while. I didn't actually start writing about basic income till the late 1990s. So over 15 years later, till I actually started writing about it.
Yeah. Okay. So when you recognize that it was a critical part of attempting to rectify some of the injustice in the world. Now, in the writing you've done since, rather than justifying universal basic income as I guess from more of a utilitarian perspective, where we're just trying to ensure the greatest good for the greatest number, or based on necessity due to the destruction of jobs due to automation or whatever, however that might be caused. The arguments that you put forth for universal basic income are rooted, at least to my knowledge, in freedom and conceptions of property. Would you say that's correct? Yeah. So I definitely want to dive into. We will dive into universal basic income towards the end of the conversation, but I think it's really worth exploring the ideas of freedom and ideas of property rights, and how they have perhaps evolved over time, and how they could actually lead to a very strong justification for universal basic income. So I think a good place to start might be with freedom or property rights. Let's go with freedom, just because I think it's going to be more succinct in this conversation. So we all have intuitive conceptions of freedom, and freedom is very much in the public discourse right now. With things like the coronavirus and just freedom of speech and all that. But how have philosophers thought about freedom, and what are the various takes on freedom that exist, and how do you conceive of it?
Well, it occurs to me on your earlier question, I didn't answer all the aspects of that question. I answered how I got into basic income, but not how I got into philosophy. So I'm thinking maybe I should back up and finish that one, because that can actually help us with this question, the questions about freedom and property.
That sounds great. That sounds great.
So Milton Friedman emphasized cost effectiveness was his justification for basic income. He wanted to streamline the welfare state, but get more out of it, because he was saying a lot of it was being wasted. And I think that was certainly true of the welfare system that we had. A lot of it was wasted. A lot of it, even today, it's a much smaller system than we used to have. And a lot of what we're spending is still spent the wrong ways, on overhead and on supervising people. As a matter of fact, we've even gone the wrong direction, increasing the supervision. So less of our spending now than 40 years ago goes to actually helping people and more to supervising them. But his effort was just do this because it's better for the people who pay taxes and things, because if they have to spend less to get more. But what I saw was that as a real challenge, not just to the right, but also to the left, that if you really want to help people, you're going to stop all this judging and stuff and really make sure just everybody has enough. If you really care about the people you're trying to help, that you ought to be doing it unconditionally. And thinking about this right to an unconditional access has led me on a thought that is a line of thought that is very different than Milton Friedman, and rejects a lot of his stuff, but also very different than what I've been hearing. I've been hearing for people supporting redistributional policies. A lot of people back then, I used to say back in the 80s that like the right wing knew how to help the poor and didn't want to, and the left wing wanted to help the poor and didn't know how. That's not so true anymore. But at that time, there was some truth in it, partly because the people in the left of center were clinging to the existing welfare state and didn't want to hear any criticism of it. They didn't want to hear basic income is better because it was so much under attack. And to some extent, they had a point, because people didn't do what Milton Friedman said, which was get rid of the welfare state and replace it with negative income tax. They just gutted the welfare state and replaced it with nothing, which was the worst of all the worst of all ideas. And I'm not for replacing the entire welfare state, by the way. But so that my interest in social justice and my interest in distributive issues in social justice led me into getting a degree in economics, because I figured, as I said, the left wing didn't know how to solve the problems, and the right wing didn't want to. The deep problems of poverty. Well, then I should be an economist, so I can find out. I can know how to solve social problems. You should be an economist. So in 1990, I entered an economics program, in PhD program at the City University of New York, and and I got my PhD 6 years later. And I realized, by that time, I kind of realized, well, actually, economically, it is not difficult to end poverty. A basic income can end poverty. There aren't a lot of serious negative side effects. It's not a difficult economic problem. And there I was, the late 90s, trying to make a career as an economist, but also wanting to write about these social justice issues, which you can write about those when you're an economist, but you can't really make your career on it. And I needed to get jobs and things like that. And it got to the point after a few years, how can I do this stuff I really want to do full time? And also, more of the time, I was finding that the barriers to a more just society are really not economic barriers. They are the barriers in people's beliefs. So I wanted to study people's beliefs. I wanted to study not so much ideology, but I wanted to study the arguments that people have against redistribution and for redistribution, and what is the theory behind this welfare type of system and that one. And I wanted to study these arguments, and the best way to do that was in political theory or political philosophy. So I got a degree. I went finally. And in 2002, it was such a crazy idea to get a second PhD, but I couldn't get it out of my head. So it was by 2002 when I finally said, I can't get this idea out of my head. I'm going to Oxford, and I'm going to get a PhD in political theory, which is essentially political philosophy taught in a political science department. So it was fast. It was much faster the second time. So I got it done in under 4 years, and I finished in 2006. And after that, eventually I got a job as a philosopher, because political philosophy, political theory, basically same thing. So eventually I got a job as a philosopher. And that gave me the opportunity to specialize in the ethics of policy. But also, now, at one point I thought it was a big mistake getting an economics PhD. But now that I'm done with it, I have 2 PhDs and I have a decent job, I realized actually having that economics background is pretty valuable. I can write about things have to do with basic income that combine the two approaches, things that economists wouldn't write or philosophers only wouldn't write, and I can go back and forth between the different disciplines. So it all worked. It all worked out in the end, but it really was a strange road to me becoming this philosopher economist.
I feel that with my brief exposure to philosophy, that to do substantive work in a variety of the disciplines, it really helped. Like it's nearly necessary to have some sort of to have a decent level of expertise in an adjacent or relevant discipline. So if you're studying consciousness or theories of mind, you need to know a bit of neuroscience or issues of social justice. Like how do we allocate our resources in such a way to minimize social injustice? Well, you need to know a bit about economics. It's like you need to know the how in order to be able to justify the why sometimes, because if it's impossible, it just kind of reduces the space of potential solutions to a problem, I guess, if you have a decent understanding of how the world works in a relevant discipline.
So then you were asking about freedom. Freedom, freedom is a long and contentious issue in political philosophy. I am, what I have been trying to do with my theory of freedom is to put more focus on the idea of what I call status freedom, because as opposed to what you could call scalar freedom. Now, that's not really very, very clear, these terms, so I have to explain them. Status freedom is what we mean when we say the prisoner was freed from prison, or we went to this. Well, Harriet Tubman went south and freed slaves. Or that when you're talking about they have the status of an unfree person and then they become a free person. And we think about, colloquially and normally, we talk about freedom in that sense. But we also talk about freedom in the sense of being more free and less free on a continuum. So scalar freedom is something that you could measure on a continuum or on a scale. Well, how much how much freedom you have? More freedom, less freedom, but without saying there's some status of being free or unfree. I want to look at the idea of having the status of being a free person or an unfree person and put more focus on that. Now, it's complicated to do that because, and one of the reasons I think a lot of philosophers don't do that is because it's complicated, because you have to have freedom to do this, that, and the other things. A lot of different things that make up freedom. When we say a person is freed, we say when Black Americans were given their freedom in 1865, we found out that actually that wasn't enough. They weren't nominal slaves, but they weren't nominally slaves anymore. But after Reconstruction went bad, it was reversed by coups from white terrorists, then the former slaves were in a new position that was not as unfree, but it was still not what you would call a truly free person. So looking at, well, what are the characteristics that separates a free person from an unfree person? And one of the things that I look on that as being forced to do someone's bidding. If somebody can put you in a position where you're forced to do their bidding, you are clearly unfree. So clearly a slave is an unfree person. A prisoner is an unfree person. But also the former slaves or black people during the civil rights movement in most of the United States were also not fully free people. They were given very limited options of what they could do and were highly policed in order to get them to do the worst jobs that white people didn't want to do. And it was very effective. A few black people managed to overcome that, and very often when they did, they were lynched. And so it was actually very effective to get the vast majority of black people to do the lowest, most uninteresting jobs. That is an example of someone who is not fully free, even though they're not a slave. So what I came up with, the idea I came up with, it was drawing on some work by Michael Otsuka, where he talks about robust self-ownership. I start with the concept of self-ownership. To be a self-owner means that no one else owns me. It doesn't necessarily mean I want to buy and sell myself, but no one else can claim me as their property. But to be a self-owner, to be a nominal self-owner, as I saw from said for the example of the former slaves during the pre-civil rights period, being a nominal self-owner is not enough, because people can use indirect ways to force you to do their bidding. So what Michael Otsuka talks about is robust self-ownership. Is that it's robust if you actually not only have the nominal right to refuse to do other things, but you have the power. So what but I also find that self-ownership is too broad in other ways. It is too broad in the sense that ownership, as philosophers define it, includes 11 different characteristics, and some of them are the right to all the income that you can make off of an asset or something like that. So ownership is a really complex thing. So I narrow down self-ownership. I start with the concept, and I broaden it by using Michael Otsuka's idea of effective self-ownership, but then I narrow it in other ways by getting down to what are the control aspects of self-ownership to control your life. So you either have effective power to control your interactions with other people. Effective control self-ownership. That's how I define freedom. There's a whole chapter on it in my book, so this is a pretty brief explanation. Now, that's also another word for it is independence. And or one phrase for it that I use for it is freedom as the power to say no. To say no, I'm not going to do your bidding. And one of the reasons that I define it this way, and I think it's so important, that it ties that back together with this idea of basic income, that I've been increasingly concerned about the freedom aspects and the unconditional aspects about basic income. So what we do, it's not really just blacks after the civil rights movement who are unfree from doing the worst jobs there are, but it is anyone who doesn't have enough access to the resources they need to survive. If you lack the access to resources you need to survive, then you effectively have to work for somebody who does. That person could be a wealthy person, could be an employer, and you might not necessarily work for them in the sense of getting a job for them. You might take them on as a client, and then call yourself self-employed. But that's not what self-employed is not what I mean by independent access to the resources you need to survive. And you might also be working for the government. You could work for a Politburo. You're still unfree. In the sense, you're unfree in the sense that you are legally put into a situation where you cannot legally use the resources of the earth to keep yourself alive. The only thing you can do is find someone who controls those resources of the earth and get their permission to access them, which you could do by begging, or by eating their garbage if they throw anything away. But most often, or you could do it by marrying them. If you're going to find a property owner who's willing to marry. But most often, that's going to be you going to work for them. So my argument is that people, the vast majority of us, are unfree in this sense that we have to go to someone with sufficient property to get access to the resources we need to produce the food, shelter, and clothing that we need to survive. So one of the arguments in my book, Freedom is the Power to Say No, is that if we want to really respect people's status as free people, we need to have some kind of universal program like basic income that gives them access to enough resources either to meet their needs on their own or to buy the things that they need on their own. And I argue that in the society that we live in now, it is much more practical to give people a basic income unconditionally for everyone in order to help them maintain this independence. We begin by respecting everyone. We respect your independence, and we're going to build a community. We're going to build a community, but we're going to build a community based on the voluntary participation of people that we give them good reason to join us instead of the way we're doing it now, which is we give them we give them really, really harsh negative reasons. If you don't join us, you will be living on the street and eating food out of dumpsters. That's what we do now. And what I'm arguing is, if we want to really have a society of free people, free interactions of people, we need to have a base where everybody is assured they can meet their own needs on their own through a basic income or some similar policy. And then anything we want them to do when join in, we ask them voluntarily. We can give them incentives by higher pay and luxuries, or we can give them other kinds of incentives such as respect and other things. But whatever we do, we're going to make a community based on the voluntary participation of all individuals.
Would you say that economic slavery would be a good way of characterizing the position a lot of people find themselves in today? Like these people who are effectively forced to exchange their labor in order to survive. Do you think economic slavery is too strong of a label, or do you think it's effective, it's necessary?
Well, it's not one that I use, but I wouldn't tell a person who does use that as wrong. I don't quite want to use the word slavery, because slavery, especially in American context, refers to one very specific and horrific institution. Actually, if you look at slavery throughout history, there are very few instances of slavery that are as bad as the way it got at the end of the slave period in places like the United States and Cuba and Brazil, the last countries that get rid of slavery. Really had the harshest, toughest forms of slavery. You'd be much better off being a slave in ancient Rome, where anybody could fall into debt and be a slave, and they didn't really look at them as inferiors. Just people had a run of bad luck. And then you have all these different kinds of slavery, all these different kinds of unfreedom. Take a member of the emperor's harem in China during the imperial period. These were exceedingly wealthy women who were unfree to leave unfree to leave their job, unfree to leave their job, and had to have sex with the king if he wanted to, which for some of them would be very rarely, since he would have hundreds, sometimes thousands of people in his harem. But yet they had ultimate luxuries and all kinds of servants. But now that is a form of slavery, and that is a form of unfreedom. It's so different, and there's so many kinds. A battered wife can be an unfree person. So many different people can be unfree. It's not a competition. Yes, some slaveries are worse than others. Some forms of unfreedom are worse than others. So when I'm saying that the low class in the world today, or in the United States today, is unfree, I don't mean they're the same as the slaves were before the Civil War. Things got better. To be a black person in the pre-civil rights era was horrible, but in most of the U.S. You were horribly unfree, but you were an awful lot better than a slave, and you're better off now after the civil rights movement, but you're still not fully free. So I'm not worried about saying, oh, this is like slavery. It's just not fully free. And it's everywhere and always wrong to create a society where you don't treat people as free and independent individuals. We got to start respecting other people's independence. There have been societies in history that have, and we're not doing it now.
Just before we move on, I'm curious about, so like a very common conception of freedom, at least in the philosophical sense, is as positive and negative, where, negative freedom is kind of freedom from interference, and positive freedom kind of relates to your capacity as an individual to lead a life of your own choosing. Is there some mapping from scalar and status freedom to these, to positive and negative freedom? Like intuitively, I think scalar freedom is analogous to negative freedom, and positive freedom could be tied to status.
No. There's no analogy. There's no analogy there. It's actually really very different. All right. Negative. Okay. This idea of negative and positive freedom are contentious claims in philosophy. Even whether there is a distinction between negative and positive freedom is controversial in philosophy. Some philosophers insist there is a coherent distinction. Others insist that there is not. Let me try to define the two. Negative freedom is freedom from interference by other people. Positive freedom is the freedom to do whatever one might want, the freedom from all barriers. Now, all forms of freedom, there's this formula that a lot of philosophers, all forms of freedom is the freedom for someone from some constraint to do something. So who's free, what constraints are they free from, and what are they free to do? So negative freedom is usually defined as a person who is free from constraints imposed by other people from doing whatever they might want to do. And they might then say positive freedom is a person who's freed from all barriers to do whatever they might want to do. So that means, and that second one, you can see how that's a wider concept. You can say, well, so in a negative sense, let's say a person with no legs are they unfree to walk, or are they just unable to walk but not unfree? Well, in a negative sense, you have to ask them, why don't you have legs? Well, if you say, okay, I was born without legs, then you're not unfree to walk. In this negative sense, no one is prohibiting you from walking. So you're not unfree to walk. You're just unable to walk. Now, in the positive sense, you're unfree. But if you say, well, I don't have legs because a car ran over my legs when I was a child and destroyed them, and that's why I can't walk. So you're in the exact same position as this other person with no legs. Neither of you can walk. But this person, his being unable to walk is the result of interference by that driver who ran over his legs. So that is what people mean by negative freedom. The problem with negative freedom is that just about any we live in a world of 7 or 8 billion people, and we're all in each other's way. We're always doing things to affect other people. To say that you have negative freedom when you're in a world where there are 7 billion people interfering with you, what you're free to do, what you're not free to do, to say that you have negative freedom, it always winds up saying, okay, well, we're not interfering with your negative freedom. When you say, like, stay over here, saying, well, look, I want you to leave me alone so that I can enjoy negative freedom. But then you got to say, well, if you're forcing me to leave you alone, then if you're forcing me to leave you alone, you're harming my negative freedom. So two people want to be in the same place at the same time. One of them has to interfere with the other one. And it's thoughts like these that lead people to think that negative freedom is incoherent. Now, I am not hugely wedded to this concept of negative freedom. However, it is the one that I use. And I use it for a simple reason that the philosopher Thomas Poga argued for, he's got some bad personal issues, but some of his philosophy is actually rather good. And Thomas Poga argues that we simply have a stronger reason to change our behavior if you can say this bad thing that happened to this other person is because I interfered with them, or we as a group interfered with them. Then we have a stronger reason than if it just happened. Maybe we should help both guys with no legs. But if you're the guy who ran over the guy with no legs, and it's your fault, you were interfered with him and made it so he can't walk, you have a really strong responsibility to get this guy some prosthetics. And whereas if, when you're in a world with millions of people with no legs and it's not because of your interference, your reason seems to be less strong. And this is why I stress negative freedom, and that effective control, self-ownership, I build up as an entirely negative concept. That that people naturally, healthy, able-bodied people naturally are capable of meeting their own needs given access to the resources of the earth. We are all evolved to live on this planet. We are all capable of getting our own food, shelter, and clothing using nothing but the resources of this planet. We're not trained to do so. If you put us down in a lush jungle with lots of opportunities to do this, most of us aren't going to know how to do it. We weren't trained. That's just because we weren't trained to by our parents. Our parents trained us for the context in which we live when that wasn't an opportunity. But maybe if we all had the opportunity to be subsistence farmers, or we all had the opportunity to be hunter-gatherers, we would all be trained in this. So it's actually, and also, the one thing we would definitely be able to do is we could definitely live with a group of people of our own choosing. And so we're interfering with you to say you can't go and be a subsistence farmer by yourself. And we're interfering with you when we're saying you can't go and be a hunter-gatherer by yourself. But we're also interfering with you when you say these 12 people or these 50 people, none of whom is a property owner, is allowed to start their own cooperative, start their own subsistence farm, start a business, start all of these things that we could do if we had access to resources. We are being interfered with. Our negative freedom is what is putting us in the position where we have to work for the people who control property. When you take the resources of the earth and you say the government owns this portion and private owners own this portion and this huge amount of people own nothing, that means those people have to work for the government or for one of the many property owners, not because of nature, but because of interference by the particular way that we've decided to divide the earth into property. We took the earth that we're all evolved to live in, and we divided it up, but we didn't give everybody a share. That is completely inconsistent with not only freedom, but equality before the law. If we're going to divide the earth, we've got to divide it in some way that recognizes people as equally evolved to live here, an equal claim to use these resources to further our life. So if some people are going to say, I get more, then they should provide a service for those who get less. And that's one of the justifications for basic income. If you want to say, I'm going to be a big property owner, all this property, great, good for you. Start your business, run what your business is. But you owe some taxes back, and those taxes are going to go to everyone else. You got to make sure it's enough that people can live on so they don't become effectively your forced servants.
Yeah, so this conception, so our conceptions of property rights and the way they take shape in our lives has a tremendous impact for whether or not we can lead lives of our own choosing. And over the past couple of years, you've written a couple of books that really dive into the issues with our conceptions of property rights and the myths that underpin them, and how they might not be as justified as was previously once thought. So what was the spark for these books? How did you I mean, I guess it kind of makes sense if you're diving into, if you're framing, if you're exploring ideas relating to justice and one's capacity just to live in the world freely. Looking into property rights seems to make a bit of sense, but it's funny that as someone with a huge interest in UBI, there's really no mention of UBI in these books, is there? It's perhaps like once or twice, like just a handful of times throughout the books, but it's mainly just that dives into the problems with conceptions of property and the philosophical bases for these in Western philosophy.
Yeah, well, the two books you're talking about, for the benefit of your listeners and viewers, are Prehistoric Myths in Modern Political Philosophy. That's the first one, and The Prehistory of Private Property. That's the second one that just came out this year. This project had several sparks sort of came together to create this project. It's not something that I in retrospect, it's not something that I would have planned. I just sort of fell into it. It took years. But what one of the sparks was a skepticism about social contract theory and the arguments that social contract theory relies on. Not all social contract theorists do, but the ones in the Lockean and most of the ones in the Lockean and Hobbesian traditions are saying that state is justified, government is justified because everybody's better off than their ancestors were before we had states. I'm like, well, how could anybody possibly know this? Everybody? So the homeless person, you're talking about the homeless person today is better off than our ancestors were 10,000 years ago as hunter-gatherers. Well, when Hobbes and Locke were in a racist society and thought the lowliest civilized man was clearly better than the naked savage, it was really easy for them to believe that, yeah, the day laborer in England would be better off than a king of a Native American community with all these naked savages to perform whatever for them. But now that we've given up those racist beliefs or trying to free ourselves from them, I've got to think about, well, what do we actually know? So to say this, and people they portray this as obvious. It's so obvious that the lowliest person in our society is better off than natives were 10 or 20,000 years ago. Well, how well do you know? All the people, those millions of people around the world, maybe billions, who make this claim, how much do they know about what it's like to be the lowliest person in their country? Do you know what it's like to live in the sweatshops that might have made our clothing? I don't know where our clothing comes from, but I know a lot of the stuff we buy comes from sweatshops around the world. They're part of our community, the people who work there. What are their lives like? Do you know? What is the life of a homeless person in the United States like? A homeless person in a really bad situation. What are the life of a migrant laborer in our communities? What are these lives like? And most people don't know. They don't have any, certainly don't have firsthand experience. And they know even less, or well, what are native peoples who live outside of state authority? What are their lives like? Nobody has firsthand experience in that unless you're an anthropologist. And so they're talking about something that they're arguing on the belief that it's obvious when it clearly is not obvious. And so I was thinking along this, well, actually, what would be sort of the ideal situation that you could live in a non-state society? I can imagine, living on a beach in Hawaii and fishing and surfing all day. And most people in Polynesia weren't able to do that because they had chiefs telling them what to do. But some people in Polynesia live lives kind of like that. So that was one spot.
Can I just ask a quick question? What do we think of as the state? Where does the state begin and where does it end? Because I think that we have like countries, the nation states, like that's quite an obvious understanding of the state. But when I think of stateless societies, I do still see them as existing as societies, and that there is some there's a rule of law, but that law might not be made explicit. It may be implicit in the way social interactions occur, and there are just some things that are permissible and some that are not, and they are just socially determined by just by virtue of the nature of the interactions and evolution of this society. So I struggle to understand where that line is kind of drawn, because you could say that the tribes in the Amazonian rainforest, they may actually, we could consider those tribes as quasi-states, because if someone does not adhere to the strictures or the social codes that are necessary for the state, for the society to survive, they may get punished and be done away with, fed to the rainforest, the animals within. So I'm just curious about how do we think of the state? How is it discussed or framed in these discussions?
Okay, so your question your question was about what sparked it, which kind of led me further into the first book that I wanted to, the Prehistoric Myths and Modern Political Philosophy. And now your question is getting us further in there. So we're actually, rather than looking at the sparks, we're actually looking fairly deeply at prehistoric myths and modern political philosophy. There were a couple of other sparks. One was that I met a philosopher. I'm the philosopher. I met an anthropologist named Grant S. McCall that was working on some similar ideas, and we ended up pooling our research. So we got one philosopher and one anthropologist. So it's not me dabbling in anthropology, and it's not him dabbling in philosophy, but it's the two of us going at it. So we've got good knowledge of both sides. And in this book, the Prehistoric Myths and Modern Political Philosophy, which was supposed to cover more, it covers this one idea that has been proposed to justify both the state and the property rights system. And that idea is this one I was just talking about, how supposedly everybody's better off in a state society and or in a society with a private property rights system than everybody is in a non-state society that has a common property regime. By a common property regime, I mean one where no one owns the land, but anyone can use the land. You can hunt, gather, you can be nomadic, but you can't just stay in one place and say, this is mine forever. That's a commons. Of course, a commons can be actually one where you live in one place for a while. But anyway, that's getting okay. So now your question was, are these societies quasi-states? And that question is getting us deeply into this social contract idea. A social contract is a very complex idea. It has roots going all the way back to Socrates. But really, it comes into Western philosophy in a big way with Thomas Hobbes. And what he's talking about, a social contract, is its definition is the establishment of a state society, and a state being a society with a sovereign government, where there's one unified authority in that society, and all the other authorities are authorized and subject to that one authority. Now, he thought a king would be the best thing to be that one authority, but he did recognize that the authority could be democratic. The authority could be an elected assembly, and that's still that one authority on top. But what it is that you have the final say. So in the United States, and I understand with your Westminster system in Australia, it works pretty similarly. We have power split between an elected president, an elected Congress, and a Supreme Court that's appointed by the other two branches. And these branches, none of those branches are on top, but together they make sovereignty. that there is a final say. Our governments are capable of saying, this is the final ruling on this issue. You're free to do that. Oh, no, you're not free to do that. That you can go to jail for. Oh, that you're unfree to do. You're not going to go to jail for it, but you got to pay somebody recompense for that. The government makes those decisions. And the exceptions to that are basically people who get away with crimes. And so the exceptions to that are actually pretty small. And so that's what the idea of sovereignty is. And what Hobbes is saying is that the state of the social contract is the establishment of sovereignty. And the absence of it is what he calls the state of nature. But that's not the only way you can define the social contract. You could also define the social contract in the sense of morality. You could think of, and it is an imaginary contract. It's not a real, well, some people think it's real, but certainly unwritten.
Come out of the womb, you just...
So you can imagine a contract where people get together and say, okay, we're all going to create a state, and the state's got to benefit us all. And that's kind of what Hobbes is. Hobbes is saying you're really bad off in the state of nature because there's no authority to punish stuff. But once you get a sovereign, this single authority on top of the whole pyramid of everything, this authority, that makes you better off. So you would, if you were actually making an agreement, you would agree to create the state. And that's why it's called a social contract. Now, but you could also imagine morality. Imagine a world with no morality and then a world with morality. And say, well, we're all better off in the world with morality, therefore I should be a moral person. So that's another use of the social contract. And then there's a third use of the social contract to say you could imagine a world where we didn't have society, where we all lived on our own with no interaction between people, except I guess you'd have briefly men and women have sex so we could reproduce, but then somebody take care of kids. I guess that'd be the way. I don't know. Well, you can imagine it. It's just whatever you want to imagine. This world without society. And you can imagine, well, we'd be pretty bad off in that, so we can imagine signing a contract to create society. And all three of those types of contracts are different. However, Hobbes thought that the other two conditions would follow from the state, because what he believed that those indigenous naked savages were so badly off without sovereignty to keep them in awe that they couldn't create society because they were all fighting all the time. He thought, and that they had no morality because he thought morality was really just following the law in your society. It's a very unusual view of morality, but that's what. So he thought all of these things came together. But the one that he said was causal was sovereignty. Now, that's really not. It turns out it's really not true, and it is kind of muddled thinking about the social contract ever since. A lot of people do understand that these are actually three different ways of thinking of the social contract, and they really have very different meanings, and they don't flow from each other. So the people you're talking about, not what we call non-state societies, they have morality and they have society. They have lots of social interaction with other people. In those two senses, they have a social contract. But they do not have a social contract in the sense of agreeing to obey any authority whatsoever. If you live with a truly non-state nomadic hunter-gatherer society, as living people have, they're getting rarer and rarer. But groups that live outside of state authority, even if we consider some state owns this territory, very often in places like Brazil or Papua New Guinea, people do not, the state really doesn't have full authority in some remote areas. So people in states like this make no commitment to obey any authority at any time. Usually, when they disagree, they split up. They're nomads anyway, so it's really easy to split up. You have a fight, you pick up your stuff, and you walk a mile down the road, you camp there. Maybe it's you and your family, maybe it's you and some friends, maybe it's you all by yourself, and you got to go find some other group to join eventually. So they have, and there is no agreed procedure. If somebody refuses to do that, you're like, look, we don't want to camp with you anymore. Go camp somewhere else by yourself. And they refuse to do that, and they maybe do violence to somebody in your group. There's no agreed procedure of how to go about that. They just fight it out. And societies are stable. You sometimes do get circles of revenge where, okay, this guy killed that guy, so somebody from his family killed him, but then somebody from his family killed them. Sometimes that will happen. It's not a perfect society, but it's also not, most of these societies are not horribly violent. They might be equivalent to a dangerous U.S. city, or sometimes a little bit worse than that, but not really, usually not to the level of violence that we saw, like, say, during World War II, or during the during major conflicts like that. So you do get societies that have the absence of sovereignty, and you find that they're decent places to live. And you look at, in many ways, people in those societies are freer and happier than the lowliest people in our society. So by looking at these, and Grant and I compare the lives of people in these non-state societies with the lowliest people, the homeless, the sweatshop worker, and other people at the bottoms of our, the battered woman, other people at the bottoms of our society, and find that there are people in all of our societies today that if they were given a choice between joining a nomadic hunter-gatherer band and remaining in their society or growing up in their society, they would be better off to choose the nomadic hunter-gatherer band. We failed in this basic idea of what's supposed to justify our society through this imaginary social contract to make sure everybody's better off by making sure that they're protected and safe and live a decent life. We have failed in that, and that means we failed in the mutual advantage.
That's a core tenet in a lot of political philosophy, that the justification for the state is that all of its citizens, regardless of status or whatever, can live a dignified life.
Yes, and you have lots and lots of people saying, "Oh yeah, we've done that easy." Well, ever since Hobbes, that's been the method of saying, "Oh yeah, we've done it. Yeah, easy. Make everybody better off. Those naked savages are so horribly off that we're all better off. We don't even have to worry about that." No, they are not. We are not. We do not make people better off.
Yeah. So that's, I think, what I don't blame Hobbes and Locke or a lot of these old philosophers in a way for some of their positions, just because they just did not know as much. Like they didn't have the theory of evolution or an understanding of just our history as a species. I mean, what was it? Solitary, brutish, and short. I don't think any humans lived a solitary existence, or if they did, they died very quickly.
So, yeah, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short is Hobbes's phrase. Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And solitary was actually the worst of all these. There is nowhere in the human lineage that connects us 7 million years ago, that connects us with our nearest relatives, the bonobos and the chimpanzees. There's nowhere in all those different species, the hominin species we go through from being them to us, there is no period where we live like orangutans that actually do live by themselves most of their lives. And a human being is incapable of living outside of society. If you take a child and try to live them without socializing them, the child will die. Even if you somehow are able to provide it with food and shelter and clothing in some way, the child will die without the rest of society. There are no, and if you actually go to indigenous societies that are stateless, you find people are all up in each other's business. They travel with their 50 closest friends. If you're in a nomadic hunter-gatherer band, you're traveling with them all the time, and they're really interested in what you're up to. It's society. It's much less alienating than society is for a lot of us. And then I say, is that, now I say, if you have a, now, people very often, when they hear this, they think when I'm saying, we're wrong to say all of us are better off. When Grant and I say that, people say, so you're saying we were all better off 10,000 years ago. No, I'm saying it is false to say all of us are better off. That is falsified when at least one of us is worse off. And it's actually a lot more than one. But I would say today maybe the average person is better off. It's hard to judge because we're better off in some ways and worse off in others. But a substantial number of people in the world today are worse off. And we have some where some people are clearly better off and another people are worse off. Then instead of having a society based on mutual advantage, we have a parasitic society. That's what we have in the world today. One that makes the privileged people better off at the expense of the disadvantaged people. A parasitic society. We need to rectify that. And that's why basic income comes up only on the last page of Prehistoric Myths. Only on the last page when we talk about that as a possible way to rectify this wrong of having a parasitic society.
I'm really curious about how you compared, like how do you determine whether or not how well off someone is? Were you taking health measures and mental, physical health? Was there a component of freedom here? How did you evaluate the differences between societies and the worst off in those societies?
Well, we look at a lot of factors. We look at, one of the obvious ones, of course, is life expectancy. Life expectancy is much higher in contemporary societies today than it is in any indigenous community. However, living long is not all there is to living, and it's not necessarily what makes us most happy. And as a matter of fact, most of the increase in our lifespan is actually caused by a decline in infant mortality, which did not really begin in a big way until about 1800. It started gradually after 1800 that our life expectancy began to rise. So when Hobbes was writing the line solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, the society that he lived in had a lower life expectancy than a lot of indigenous communities, the ones that he described as nasty, brutish, and short. And so state societies and property rights-based societies are really not all of them, and most of them have not had longer life expectancies. We do now. However, most of that is from infant mortality, and it's something that people just grow to accept. We're actually only, if you look at the age of senescence of people, the age when you start to decline for old age, that's only increased by about 10% in the entire history of medicine. It's only increased by about 10%. We've done good at extending people, having them live longer while they're declining, which has some benefit, but also has a lot of side effects if you're in a lot of pain and lower quality of life. And we've done better at getting people up to that level. But we actually haven't increased the life. So this idea that we're on the verge of creating people that are going to live to be 200, we've only really increased lifespans 10%. We're a long way from that. Somebody's going to have to come up with a really new idea. Now, so we live longer, but we're not really healthier. We have this idea that we're so much healthier because we have all of this medical care. But actually, the medical care that we have is mostly fixing problems that our society has created. Cancer is almost non-existent without the toxins and the other things that we have in modern society. Cancer, heart disease does not exist among indigenous peoples living in stateless societies. many malnutrition, all sorts of problems that we have simply created. Most of our disease, and even a disease like COVID is, unless it was created in a lab, COVID is created by the interaction of humans and animals, and then spreads in dense human situations. When you have people who don't have livestock, who only hunt animals, they hunt animals and then they cook them and eat them and don't live with them, you don't get people catching diseases from animals, where a lot of our diseases come from. And when you have them living at that low population density, they're not spreading. So epidemics are not a big problem. Epidemics are a problem of dense state societies. That's why so many native peoples in Australia, Africa, and the Americas died when Westerners got there, because they brought their zoonotic diseases. So in health, actually, health is maybe a wash. Then we look at things like freedom. In a negative sense, you are so much freer in a nomadic hunter-gatherer society than you are in contemporary society. And there's just not people giving you orders. You don't like the way this group's doing, go off and join another group, or go off with your couple of your best friends and go live with them. Do it the way you want to do it. You have tremendous sexual and gender freedom. A lot of indigenous societies, stateless societies, recognize transgender people and recognize one form of same-sex marriage or another. And you also very often have greater freedom of women, who are not perfect equals everywhere. But in a lot of nomadic hunter-gatherer societies, they're an awful lot closer to equality than in most state societies, and also more free from violence. Rape and domestic abuse are sadly side effects of privacy. It's really hard to rape a woman when everybody lives in tents. It's hard to beat your wife when you live in a tent and there's another tent right next to yours, and people will stop you and prevent you from that. And it's hard to treat a woman that way when she can just get up and join the next tribe. So in a lot of ways, people in the loosest, smallest, most stateless societies we know are better off than many people in society today.
So a lot of our well-being, especially within the 21st century, is dependent upon property, our ability to buy things, to earn money, and to claim ownership over that money, to own land, to lay claim to some object or something. And from what I understand, it has generally been thought that there is some natural right to property, and that might not be the case. So could you first describe what we mean by natural? Because I don't know, the more I'm learning, the more weird I get with just understanding words that I thought I actually understood. So what's been the evolutionary, or what's been the historical conception of property rights in political philosophy, and why might these conceptions be built upon an empirical house of cards?
Yeah, well, the natural right to private property is the idea. That's one of the ideas that we debunk in the second anthropology book, Grant and I. So the first one is really all about this one thing, that we're all better off in a society that has private property and or a state. And then the second book looks at three other claims. The claim that equality is impossible, or at least that it's in conflict with freedom. The idea that capitalism is more consistent with negative freedom than any other system, and the idea that there's some natural right to private property. Natural rights theory is one way of looking at morality. People sometimes think, well, if you don't believe in rights, you're against morality. And that's not true. Rights are one way of conceiving morality. I'm a moral person because I respect people's rights. Is one way to say I'm a moral person. Another way to say, well, I don't know, what rights do they have? Another, maybe a moral person is to treat other people with equal concern and respect and listen to their perspective. And it's not about deciding what rights are or not. But the idea of a natural right to private property is already using this rights idea, that there are natural rights that we can discover by reason. If we think about what a person truly needs, then we can come up with a natural right. Some of these are like no-brainers. All right, we should all agree that it's a natural right for a person not to be killed randomly by other people. That if somebody just wants to kill you for fun, not in self-defense or anything, they just want to kill you for fun, they're violating your natural right to life. And that I think is perfectly reasonable. Whether it's best to call that a natural right or to call it something else, I'm a little on the fence on. But it says something that there's something is plausible about this idea of natural right.
So they're in a way they're self-evident. Is that,
yes.
Would that be?
Yeah, self-evident to anybody who really sits down and thinks about it. And of course, then the U.S. Declaration of Independence draws on this when it says it draws on the idea of natural rights. We said we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, actually, they're drawing on John Locke, whose three rights were life, liberty, and property. John Locke, then, is trying to say that property, along with life, which that's the no-brainer, then liberty, which is really vague, what exactly you mean, the devil could be in the details about what you mean by liberty, but then he puts in property. And what Locke is saying is that we all naturally want property. That everybody wants to claim things. You want to go out there in the natural world and you want to claim stuff and say, this is mine. It is only mine. It belongs to me. I need it to further my projects, whatever I'm working on. I got to have this. I got to have security of this. I want it. So I'm going to go out and claim things. And then he wants to say, and then he says that's natural. That is what people do. And then we got to look at, well, when is it just to claim things? He says, if you mix your labor with it, if you say find a stick and you haven't done anything with it, you can't really say I own that. But if you take that stick and you sharpen it into a spear, that's your stick. Which has some plausibility if there are a whole bunch of sticks around and this is the only one that's made into a spear. Well, it's made into a spear because it's yours. It sounds quite reasonable to say that's yours. And so he calls that appropriation, original appropriation. And he gives that right not just to things we find, but also to land. That if you were the first person to go out and clear land, and then to clear land and farm it, you're then improving the land. You're giving it greater value. Wasn't that valuable as a forest or whatever? But once you cleared it and planted crops on it, you made it so it yields so much more useful food for human beings. And maybe you took that trees and made them into a cabin or something. He's saying that should be yours. And that is what humans naturally do. Humans want to take the resources of the earth, mix their labor with them, and make it into private property and call it their own. And that if we all think hard enough, if we all use our reason, we're all going to come to this conclusion. Yeah, that's a right. I have a right to what's mine. You have a right to what's yours. And we all have a right to trade them. And trading that is going to create inequalities. But that's okay, because we're all going to be better off because trading is good for people. Property is good for people. Well, that's the idea we debunked in the first book. Well, actually, we don't all get better off. But what he's arguing then is that private property is a natural right. The argument is not that every owner in the world today can trace his land back to the first guy to mix his labor with the land, to clear the land and stuff, and that there's never been any injustice in that. That's not what he's saying. He's, of course, admitting there's been a lot of injustice. But him and people who follow him that I call propertarians, because they're so concerned about the right to private property, sometimes they call themselves conservatives, sometimes they call themselves libertarians, anarcho-capitalists. There's a bunch of other people who share these sorts of beliefs about property, and even a lot of people that are skeptical about property concede this idea that at least concede this idea that it's a natural right. But this natural right to private property, is it real? Is it really, is this what people want to do? Now, the way that people usually criticize the idea of a natural right to property is to say there simply isn't one. They're saying it's not moral to go and clear the land and appropriate land and say it's my private property. And they will criticize it that way. And that's one legitimate way to criticize it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it seems like it's anthropocentric, and, you know, we are these transcendent, amazing animals who can just lay claim to regions of land or things that are homes to so many other organisms, and that because I have done something, I have complete, legitimate, total claim to this. It just kind of strikes me as incredibly unjust. But yeah, sorry for cutting you off.
Well, that's a moral criticism of it. And I think the moral criticisms of it are completely legitimate. However, when you only make this moral criticism, then you concede this ground to libertarians. Well, if we believe in the right to appropriation, and we believe it's more, if there is a right to appropriation, then we have to have a private property system. Because despite all that injustice, had we had appropriation from the beginning and there wasn't that injustice, we would have a property rights system now, a private property system. So if you can find some injustices, we'll be happy to rectify those, shuffle things around. But when we're done, there's going to be rich people and there's going to be poor people, because that's the natural thing, the way people want to do it. That's what appropriation leads to. And so what the different tack we're taking, we're not questioning it from a moral base. Okay, you're saying that's what's moral. Okay, we're going to say that's what's moral. We're going to look at who did the original appropriation. What kinds of original appropriations do people tend to do? And do these original appropriators tend to establish private property? Locke tells that story about the farmer that goes out in the woods. Is that what people do? Because I could tell another story where a group of people go out to the woods together, and they do it together and they clear the land together with the intention of creating shared property. Or another person who is an individual goes out in the woods by themselves with the intention of declaring themselves king of this new land. There's a story. Now we got three stories. We're always hearing this one story over and over again from the private property people. But now I just gave you three stories. Which one's more plausible? Are any of these stories plausible? Because those second two don't lead to that private property rights system. If what people actually do when they appropriate property is more like either those second two, then you don't get a private property system. There's no reason to believe that there's anything natural about the private property system. So Grant McCall and I look at what are systems like that don't have private property, and what are systems like that have sort of quasi-property, and how do we get from a world where we know that 10, 20,000 years ago there was no private property. The world was a commons. You could hunt and gather on it, but you couldn't claim it. We know that's what it was like for the first 200,000 years that full humans were on this planet. And then property rights start to develop. Was this natural right in waiting all this time? What happens? Now, first of all, when they was like Locke's criteria was mixing your labor with the land, but there's a lot of other people who are essentially Lockeans that reject that criteria and say, well, it's just first claim or it's first use, or first claim, first use, something like that. Whatever these criteria could be, they're slightly different. But so when you look at nomadic hunter-gatherers, as I've said, they treat the entire earth as a commons. Often it's an open commons in the sense that anyone can hunt and gather in here. You don't even have to be a member of our band or our tribe. There are other hunter-gatherers who treat the land as sort of a closed commons. Well, this land, anybody in our tribe can come to this land, but if this next tribe comes over here, they better ask permission or we're going to fight. In that sense, not all hunter-gatherers. It's not a completely open common, but it is one that is, to the extent that that commons is owned, it's owned by the community as a whole. And even find, okay, well, that's, and a Lockean could say, well, that's the land. They don't mix the labor with the land. They only hunt on the land. Well, first of all, I'm not sure that's really true, because that they don't change the land by mixing their labor with it, because hunter-gatherers have killed off a lot of predators. The saber-toothed tiger, the woolly rhinoceros, all kinds of animals have been killed off by human beings. That very much alters the land. That could qualify as ridding the land of a dangerous predator might be a stupid thing to do. It might turn out to be a stupid thing to do, but it changes the land more than growing crops for one season and then they could easily grow back. So they do alter the land, and even the other goods that they have. When you're in a stateless, nomadic hunter-gatherer tribe, settled hunter-gatherers are different, but nomadic hunter-gatherers also tend to have nothing like private property in goods that they made. If the rule tends to be, if you want to camp with us, you got to share. Okay, you killed this big game. If you kill this game, if the game is just enough for you and your family, then okay, then it's yours. Okay, but if there's enough to share, you must share. You cannot say, oh no, I'm going to cure this meat and keep it for my family for later on. I'm not going to share it with you. You guys get your own meat and cure that. You cannot do that. They will not let you. You don't ever get to camp with us again. You can't be a part of the society if you won't share like that. And even other things. If you've got 2 spears and another guy doesn't, or if you have a spear that you're not using because you're doing something else, you have to share that. Sharing is mandatory. So there's really no respect for these sites by the people who have really the best claim to be the original appropriators. And then if you say, okay, well, if you've really got to be a farmer to be original appropriators, then the book we go on to the oldest known farming communities, which were Swidden agriculturalists who went out to the woods, like Locke said, but not as an individual, like Locke said. They went out in groups of several hundred people, usually, cleared the land together, burned the trees and stuff together to create a nice mulch for the soil, and then everybody got a plot, but nobody got ownership of that plot. This season, you'd all plant on your plot. Then during the off season, maybe animals would graze there, and you'd all hunt on the common woods around it. Then the next season, you'd all get a plot, but it'd be another plot. And getting access to the plot is not contingent on having been part of that group that helped clear the land to begin with. If you're a new person who's joined in the years that they've been on the same spot, you get the same access to a plot as everyone else. All you got to do is be a member of the group. And this kind of group agriculture, there are parallels to this in peasant communities around the world that survive into the modern era. They're not moving from place to place, but you get this idea that agriculture at the beginning is a joint project. It's a family farm. Is an extremely late development. Long before the family farm, there's this cooperative village agriculture where nobody really owns the land. You see this throughout Europe in the Middle Ages. And you see it really throughout the world in the same period. And it doesn't end until the Enclosure movement in Europe and the colonial movement outside of Europe, which is happening at the same time. That's when by this time they've appointed lords over the peasants. And lords are saying, well, I want this to be my property. These are the people that appropriate. They might be the people who mix their labor with the land every day, but I'm the lord. I should get the property. that's where private property, starts to become ubiquitous. It had begun in ancient times. It began in cities, but it began not with private acts of appropriation, but by kings and royal families saying, well, this is my private estate. That's the public things I own in the name of the people, but this is mine. And it begins from the top down, just the opposite of what the idea that there's a natural right to private property is based on. It's based on the claim that it's the bottom up and it's the government that interferes. But actually, from the bottom up, we get shared property and we get the government interfering, beginning with those ancient kings saying, me and my wife and my sons and some top officials, we get some private estates. It trickles down from there. And when it finally gets to the rural lords in England, you get the Enclosure movement in England and throughout Europe. You get the Enclosure movement where they create private property in land throughout Europe. And at the same time, they're conquering the world and they're finding hunter-gatherers and they're finding peasant agriculturalists and they're forcing all of them to adopt this private property system where a landowner has this really strong private property, and then all those people who used to share out the land are his tenants, or in later history, his workers, his hired laborers. And then people lose their direct access to the land and then have to do whatever they can, whatever the Lord says, or whatever at least some lord or some owner will say in order to keep themselves alive. And this was part of the motivation. When the Enclosure movement happened in Europe, as we mention in the book, we recount some of them. A lot of people said outright, well, the reason we need to establish lords as full owners of the land and make everyone as hired workers is to get the peasants to work more. When the peasants control the land, they don't work so hard for us. It's hard to hire them to do the stuff we want. We'll get more labor out of them if the Lord owns the land, and those people have to work for a living. Have to work by following the Lord's orders for the word. And it worked in the Enclosure movement in Europe. It worked in the colonial movement across the rest of the world, and it worked when we freed the slaves. When we freed the slaves, well, we'll just keep them really poor, and then they'll do similar work that they did when they were slaves.
And well, it's working right now as well. I remember just recently reading news of in the US there being labor shortages, or businesses are just unable to find people to work for them. But then you look at like the conditions of the work, and you're like, so what you're saying is you want to pay someone, $10 an hour to work 12 hours a day, 5 days a week, and earn just enough to survive. And you're surprised that no one wants to do that. I can imagine lots of people would actually rather be homeless and do some begging and whatever than actually put themselves through such to live like that, to live just working in these undignified positions, doing things just merely to survive.
Yeah, so many of our jobs are terrible jobs. Franklin Roosevelt said that if you don't want to pay, if you don't want to pay a decent wage, we don't want your business in our country, and that's one of the reasons he gave for introducing the minimum wage. Unfortunately, the minimum wage was supposed to be a living wage, but they never really protected it in a way to make it a living wage. But that's, I think, the wrong way to go about it. When you have an idea that we need a minimum wage and we need to raise the minimum wage up to a living wage, what you're admitting is that we've got an incentive problem, that workers have an incentive to work even at below living wage levels, and that employers have an incentive to pay them below living wage levels. And when you say all we're going to do is increase the minimum wage, you're admitting that we have this incentive problem. You're not really changing the incentives. You're just truncating those incentives by saying, okay, well, you have to pay this much. A better way is to look at the source of that incentive problem. That incentive problem is because workers are desperate to get a job to survive, because it's the only legal way to survive. So if you give workers the opportunity to live without selling their labor, by having a basic income, you give employers to make sure that every job is a good job. How do I get this person to do this job voluntarily? Well, I got to pay them a good wage and give them good working conditions. It's got to make them a lot better off than they are on those basic income. You do that, and you're going to get. You don't really so much need the minimum wage. You might get a much better pay and better working conditions for everyone in the lower class. We could get away the horrible treatment that we have people in our meatpacking industry and our migrant laborers and so forth, and so many other bad jobs that we can sit down and catalog.
Yeah, we'll just put a pin in this because I really want to dive into this just a little bit later. But I just want to go back to talking about some of the claims or what is discussed in your book. One of the, I guess, key claims is that inequality is, well, not the claims that you make, but the claims that you undermine or take on, is that inequality is natural and inevitable. So what sort of inequality are you referring to here? Because I think it's a messy topic, and I'd just like to highlight that, to ask that before we dive into it.
Yeah, when you're talking about inequality, by the way, I'm giving very, very long-winded answers to all your questions. I hope that's okay. So.
Oh yeah, no, don't worry at all. I mean, the longer the better. We've got time. I've got plenty of time, so I'm happy to sit here for as long as you are willing. So,
okay,
long-winded is the way to go.
All right. So, when we're talking about inequality, I mean, I'm talking about, we're not talking about being unequal. Of course, there's inequality in height between short people and tall people. There's inequality in hair color and eye color and skin color and many, many things like that. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is human-created inequalities, especially in social, political, and economic realms. Okay, we all have these different physical characteristics. That doesn't mean one person has to be higher in society than another person. Just because I'm taller doesn't mean, just because I'm so good looking doesn't mean I have to be higher than other people. Doesn't mean I have to have more political power. Doesn't mean I have to have better. I have to have a higher standard of living than other people. Those things are socially created, and people who are at the top of the hierarchy, whether it's social, political, economic, or all three, for as long as we've had recorded history, have come up with some reason about how it's really natural and inevitable that society must be unequal and the people like me must be on top. That's just the natural way of the world, and getting rid of that is not possible, or is not possible, or in conflict of freedom or something else like that. It's just, and it's always funny because you run into an interesting. So what we do is we go back and look at the pattern of people saying this over time, you find huge agreement of the predominant ideology in society will be justifying its inequality. That will be the predominant ideology in society, and it will be justifying really restrictive, forcible laws that enforce that hierarchy. So they're saying the hierarchy is natural, but then they're also saying, well, we need all these laws to enforce it. Well, if it's so damn natural, why do you need all these laws to enforce it? That's one of the patterns you notice. But another pattern you notice is that all these different societies have some ideology that tells you why their inequality is natural and inevitable, but they all disagree about why. That's gotta no. So those two factors already, before I even tell you anything about this, have to put some doubt on this idea that inequality is really natural and inevitable. If it was, you'd think we'd all be coming up with the same explanation for it. And if it really was natural and inevitable, you wouldn't think we'd have to enforce it so much. But if you want to create if you want to create such inequality, you do have to enforce it. But that's what we get to when we debunk these ideas. So we start out looking, what are probably some of the oldest claims of inequality? And sadly, of course, the oldest is sexism. There are societies that have more equality between the sexes, but when there is inequality, there's almost always some inequality between the sexes, and it is as far as I know, always favored men. I hear stories about societies where women are dominant. I've never actually read any anthropology that shows such a society. It always seems to be men are more favored here, less favored, but it's the men who are dominant. Now, and you do get that even in the most equal societies. Now, the first societies that have really significant inequalities of political power and of standard of living are probably chiefdoms. Now, we have chiefdoms that survived into the modern era and were observed by historical writers and anthropologists. And we have some reason to believe that these chiefdoms are similar to the first chiefdoms that appeared probably 10,000 years ago. We don't know that for sure, but we have if you look at a chiefdom in Hawaii in 1750, shortly before contact, its archaeology would look pretty similar to the kind of chiefdoms we found in Turkey 10,000 years ago. So we're thinking maybe there's going to be some similarities. We don't know that for sure, but we do have this tendency of chiefdoms observed all over the world will tend to have a chief and his henchmen, and they will claim descent from some favored ancestor. Usually they wouldn't claim divine status. They would claim that they're divinely favored, but not divine beings, that they're somehow favored by the gods and high birth, and that justifies their position, and everybody else is naturally given low birth by the god or gods, and so it is natural that this person be on top and those people be below. That you get in a lot of observed chiefdoms. Now, there are some chiefdoms that are more equal. The Iroquois Confederation, or the Iroquois Confederation, as we call them in the United States, the Iroquois Confederation was relatively equal as chiefdoms go. That one was a pretty large-scale chiefdom that was actually fairly equal, that didn't have so much of these chiefs being high birth and stuff like that. So it's hard to say how many chiefdoms are like this, but probably the first really unequal societies were chiefdoms like this, societies maybe 5,000-10,000 people, where that had one guy on top that claimed like divine descent from ancestors. And of course, you still get this in the world today. Japan, the emperor of Japan claims to be descended from the highest born child of the sun god or something like that. And you got something like this in ancient Egypt, where the pharaoh was supposed to actually be a god. It's taken it a little step further when you're not just favored by the gods, but you are a god. You get that in ancient Egypt. You get that in the Roman Empire. Then in the Middle Ages, these kind of issues had a problem, and that was the growth of the Abrahamic faith. The Abrahamic faiths are all based on the idea of the covenant, where Moses goes up to the mountain and all of the people make a deal with God, and in that sense of making this deal with a God, there is the equality of all believers. So you have these three major religions in the West that are all based on the basic equality of at least of all believers, if not all human beings. But then you realize none of these religions are setting up egalitarian states. They're starting with this idea that everybody's equal, and they got to set up some kind of justification for it, for this. And what they come up with is a couple of things. The idea of the great chain of being, that we're all morally equal in the eyes of God, but also that we are at higher or lower stations. And God has chosen us for our station. He's given us a particular task for our station. And being happy and being a good believer is to know your place in this station that you have in life, from the high end to the low end. And in the modern era, and this actually, these kind of ideas held sway in Christendom for 1,000 years, from the fall of Rome until the early modern period. This idea that everybody had a station in life, and that justifies the king's position and the lord's position and the knight's position and the peasant's position. All of that that was extremely popular and well accepted. Of course, racist explanations were given for inequality as well. That's racism isn't new. It comes and goes in different forms, but like the ancient Greeks justified slavery with some racist ideology. Is that only the Greeks were capable of the highest civilization? It was too cold in Europe, so people developed stunted, and it was too hot in the Middle East, so they were more susceptible to dictators. They had some crazy ideas like that. But in the early modern era, religious ideas were not holding sway as much. And so people need some other idea people are looking for other ideas. And Thomas Hobbes comes up with one of the most popular ones. And so along with the social contract, the idea that we have a functional reason for inequality. The king is not the leader because he's divinely favored, but the king is the leader because we need inequality to keep the peace. That if it wasn't for the king having an army and leading the army and making the laws and being the fountain of all judicial decisions, if it wasn't for the king, we'd all be at each other's throats. We'd have a war of all against all, and life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. We need the king, and we have a functional idea of inequality. That even if we were all equal, we still need some people to have power over others. Now, I think that one is clearly not so true because, say, a police officer can arrest a celebrity, but yet most police officers are not really higher in our hierarchy than the famous celebrity they might be arresting for whatever thing. So the functional idea, I don't know how that will.
I know that I think there's data that supports that, greater inequality leads to greater social unrest. It's just inequality is not good for the stability of a state. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I got into the. Yeah, I guess I shouldn't have got into debunking these things. That's another part of the book. So then after this, then you get in this idea of they're trying to come up with like quasi-scientific justifications of it. So you get the head and the hand analogy. Is that there are certain people who are head people. They're the thinkers. And there are certain people who are hand people. They're the doers. The thinkers have so much more complex thinking that they need to be the leaders. The doers can't work all that stuff out, but they're good with working with their hands. So we need the thinkers on top and the doers on the bottom. And who are the thinkers? Oh, it turns out they're the upper class. The upper class just happens to be the head people. What a great stroke of luck that the head people just happen to manage to get themselves in charge rather than just some brutes that had a lot of power, that took power and forced themselves on everyone else. So that is the head in the hand analogy, which gives, so the idea, that kind of implies that like maybe if you start to think about evolution, that, well, some of us must be evolved to be heads and others evolved to be hands. But that led us, after the theory of evolution came out, that led people to something that clearly took off from the head in the hand ideology, but actually really rejected some of the important parts of it, and that is eugenics. The idea that actually there's a whole continuum of who are evolved to be the smartest and the intelligent and the most fit, and who are actually not very well evolved, and this idea that evolution used to be killing off all of the undesirables, and evolution isn't doing that now that we have medicine and we have help for the poor and stuff like that. The undesirables aren't getting killed off, and they're breeding, and they're going to pollute everybody else's breeding, and that's going to hurt all those really good gene people at the top. And that is the idea of eugenics. You need selective breeding to get rid of those unfit people. And you can see its similarities with the head in the hand, but the head in the hand thing, even though it put some people on top and some people are evolved to be on top and other people are evolved to be on bottom, at least with the head in the hand ideology, the smart people needed the dumb people. They needed the dumb people to do the labor of the hands. So there at least was some idea that we all need each other. But once you get to eugenics, you have really the first one that we don't even need the lower class. We want to get rid of the lower class. We want the lower class to die off. Then, I guess, presumably, when eugenics reaches its full fruition, maybe you could actually have equality. So equality there is natural now, but not inevitable once the eugenics manage to breed out all those undesirable people. But of course, eugenics didn't last very long. It was very much discredited by some of its most ardent followers, the Nazis, but it was really mainstream before the Nazis gave it a bad name. In the late 18th, early 20th, 1800s, early 1900s, it was extremely popular across the political spectrum in most of the English-speaking countries and a lot of the other Western European countries as well. And it did start to fall away in the 1930s before it was really discredited. It was falling away, but it went on. And so then to get us to modern political philosophy, we'll often argue not so much that equality is impossible, but that equality is in a conflict with freedom. That if you're going to have freedom, you're going to have inequality. And if you try to create equality, it's going to cost you your freedom, and maybe it won't even deliver you. It won't even deliver equality. It will just end up. Some dictator is going to point themselves head, and he'll really be far more unequal than everybody else was. And of course, there's some plausibility to that because there are societies that claim to be creating equality, and they actually produced dictatorships that were just as unequal or more unequal than what came before, such as Soviet Russia and Maoist China and North Korea and so forth. There's at least some plausibility of this idea that there is a trade-off between freedom and equality, that equality is impossible without a big sacrifice of freedom. That's the most popular way that this idea plays itself out today. But the same pattern exists. First of all, this is just the handy explanation for why we have to have inequality in the world today, and it's in a long line of these. The same kind of thing. We're all justifying the type of inequality that exists in the world we live in, that benefits the privileged people today. So that makes this belief suspect. Another one is that it's heavily enforced. They try to talk about the society be really free, but they have a lot of police and a lot of courts and a lot of government-made rules that say this guy owns property, that guy doesn't. These rich people can trade it among themselves, but everybody else, they gotta be servants to the people who own property before they can get some. If they try to get some property on their own, they're going to be arrested. So it's really heavily enforced, so it's not really so different than these other ideologies. So this whole history should make us doubt this idea that there's this natural trade-off between freedom and equality.
And just to reiterate, it's not we're not referring to equality of income or wealth, but it's more like social status equality rather.
Okay, I want to talk about all three of them, the three major forms of inequality. Equality in economic inequality, which is wealth, income, standard of living. Then there's social inequality, people exonerated as being better than others, and there's political inequality. People will have the power to order other people around. Very often these things go together. In the United States and in Australia, the people at the top are at the they're the high society. They're the ones with the wealth and the power and the high standard of living, and they control our politics. As much as we like to claim that we're democracies, most countries that claim to be democracies the decision making is highly dominated by the class that owns the most property.
Yeah, okay. Just on this topic of inequality, I think a lot of what I see that's in defense of mainly income inequality, let's say, but it's this notion that people are solely responsible for the wealth that they generate, and they are, I should be able to keep all of my hundreds of millions because I caused it to be created, all of this wealth, and because it was by my hand, I should be entitled to keep all of it. And fitting in with what you've been saying is that idea and that level of inequality is perpetuated by the social conception of, or the socially enforced rules, you could say, that dictate the redistribution of things like wealth or property. And it's this, when I say social, I don't mean like it's democratic, but it's just the way the society has come together, and these things might be imposed in a top-down way, but it's justified in that way. I don't know if I've made myself clear here, but do you understand what I'm trying to get at?
I'm sorry, I gotta admit that I don't understand what you're getting at here.
No, maybe I don't think I understand what I'm trying to say. I guess it comes down to what justifies our claim to property or the money that we earn. Like there's a common libertarian argument for taxation is theft. I am responsible for the generation of this wealth, and I should not have to part with it. I should not have to give it to the state because I've created it. And we all have different capacities to generate wealth that are not a function of our own actions. They're just, a lot of it's just got a lot to do with luck. Anyway, I don't really know where I was going, but now I've lost the thread, and I'm scrambling for it. But this kind of
that ties some of the different claims that we address in these books together. The idea of there being this conflict between freedom and equality is tied into this idea that the type of property rights system we have is a natural right, that people just go out and spontaneously create this property system. And in fact, this property system was created by the government with the intention of benefiting the people most privileged in that society. And there's nothing natural about that right to property. And to create property involves interference. Now, if I want to take a piece of land, whatever mumbo jumbo I might do to appropriate it, if I want to take that and make it mine, that means I want to interfere with anybody else who might use it. So what private property is the right to interfere with your neighbors, with the other people in the entire world. To say, I have dominion over this and you don't, I can interfere with your uses that you might make of this land and or resource, and you cannot interfere with the resources I might make of it. And when you're doing that, then you are making everyone else less free. You are interfering with them. There's a trade-off. You get more freedom, they get less. Well, if we're all getting property, that freedom, that trade-off might be worth it. But if some get that property and others don't, you're just making all those people less free. And then you have to enforce that. You have to enforce that with a lot of laws against trespassing, against stealing, and against vagrancy, and against people, and against poaching, and anything that's going to give people the possibility to keep themselves alive without working for the people who've assumed control of our resources. Now, so we just debunk this claim. And of course, the debunking of these claims is all kind of tied together as well, because you debunk these claims and you look at societies that you look at. If you want to debunk the claim that equality is impossible, well, you look at throughout the anthropological record, are there societies that are equal? Now, you're never going to find a society that has perfect equality in every conceivable way. But that in no way says, well, therefore we have to have this really highly unequal society we have. In the same sense that you will never find a society that has perfect inequality. You will never find a society that has an absolute hierarchy where everyone has their exact place and no two people are equals in any significant way. And then it would be a fallacy to say, since we can't have perfect hierarchy, then we have to have complete equality, or as near equality we can get to. And if we say, well, we can't have near equality, therefore we have to have this extreme hierarchy like we have in our country today, that doesn't make any sense. So what we're looking for is a society where people are substantially equal in standard of living, in social respect, and in political power. And there are societies like those. And it's, again, this is where we go back to the nomadic hunter-gatherer bands, groups of usually less than 60 people who will stay in one place for a few weeks and hunt in that area, and then move somewhere else for a few weeks and hunt in that area, and so forth. Groups where people come and they go, they're camping with this group for a while, and they're camping with that group for a while. These very loose confederations of people. Or I said they have no political authority. When they make decisions, they talk them out. Anybody who's old enough to want to be in the conversation can be in the conversation. If you don't like what the group decides, you go off and do things your own way. Basically, no one has power over anyone else. And as a matter of fact, groups like these tend to affirm everyone's right to be totally free from anybody's orders. Nobody has to work for someone else. Nobody can give a person orders. Anthropologists say you can live in a society like this for your whole life and never hear an order. So you have extremely free societies where political power is equal, freedom is equal, socially very equal. To the extent that you have any social differences, you do have people who are maybe people who are more respected, and they tend to respect elderly people more. But everybody expects to be elderly in their terms, so these kinds of inequalities aren't terribly significant. And you get extremely equal consumption. I mean, to find inequalities in the society, they've had to go around, they've had to reach because the actual goods that they have are just so incredibly equal. You know, everybody's going to have their tools and their portable shelter in a nomadic society. And that's about all people keep. Maybe a tiny bit of jewelry. But you don't want to take too much of that because you got to move it from place to place all the time. To find inequalities, they have to look at things like, well, do good hunters consume more? Do they have a better diet? Okay, and you do find that a good hunter and a family of a good hunter might have a slightly better diet than someone else. If you're getting down to counting calories, I think what you have found is a society that's very equal. And I've already argued earlier in this conversation that these are societies that are also very free. They're very free in the sense that people don't give each other orders. You're free to leave this group. You're free to not do what this group says. And we don't have anything like that. So we have societies that are far more unequal and less free for the least free of us. So we're losing out against hunter-gatherer bands in these two important ways. The advantage that we have over hunter-gatherer bands is in positive freedom. It's in opportunity, that yet we can create all kinds of opportunities that don't exist in this society with very high negative freedom. But what we have to do if we want to take advantage of these opportunities, we have to make them consistent with greater freedom and greater equality and make sure that no one's better off. And that's where we're failing. So we've got to treat people a lot better in a way that makes them freer from following other people's orders if they don't want to. And that's why we tie this into basic income, is that a basic income can give that person the power to refuse following other people's orders. If you want me to follow your orders, you make it worth my while. You don't starve me to death till I do what you say. You don't separate me from my own ability to make my living on my own and with the people of my choosing by mixing our labor with the land, by saying I can only mix my labor with what I can get permission from a property owner to mix it with.
Yep. So that's a good time to talk about UBI. Before we dive into it properly, I guess most of the arguments leveled against it, at least from what I see, is just, it's just completely infeasible. We can't afford it. There's no way we can pay people, everyone in society, and enough to satisfy their basic needs. And from what I've seen on numerous occasions, that these claims aren't, they're not verified. They're actually not legitimate. It's not as expensive as you would think to actually provide this for all citizens. Is that the case?
What people mean by we can't afford it varies from person to person. There's a lot of ways to define what we can afford. Anything that costs more than you think it's worth is unaffordable. I can say I might buy some. I might hire somebody to come clean my. I could afford to hire somebody to come and cook dinner for me every night. Well, not every night, but I could afford somebody to do that an awful lot, fairly often. But I just as soon cook my dinner myself. It is not worth the price. I could afford it in the sense that it wouldn't break me, but I can't afford it in the sense it's more than I want to pay for how much I enjoy that service. Now, if you oppose basic income, if you hate the idea of people getting an income, even if low-income people get an income, even if they don't work for wealthy people, then you're going to say we can't afford basic income in the sense that it is a luxury that I don't want to pay for. In a sense, it's cost more than you think it's worth. In that sense, it is always unaffordable to the people who say it's unaffordable, and there is no data that can disprove that. But there's, of course, another sense. When we think of affordable, we usually think of an objective sense of affordable. Is that objectively, there are some things that I cannot afford. I cannot afford to move into the top floor of the Four Seasons and stay there for the rest of my life. That would eventually exhaust all of my savings on this frivolous, stupid luxury. So that I physically cannot afford to do that, or financially cannot afford to do that. Even if no matter how much I wanted to do that, I could not do that. Now, it is possible that basic income could be like that. If we had an income that was a basic income that was really high and generous, and then and everyone decided, well, with an income this high, I don't want to work at all, so I'm just going to live off the basic income. If everybody did that, then the basic income would be unsustainable. In that sense, we would not be able to afford it. And in that sense, we could say it's unaffordable. Now, and there must be some level of basic income that is unaffordable. Like in the United States, per capita income is what, I think, $60,000 or something like that. Well, if we had a basic income that was $100,000, that'd be more. You could buy more with your basic income than we can produce with everybody working. Clearly, we cannot afford that level of basic income. But the question is, what level of basic income is sustainable? And in that sense, we've studied basic incomes as high as 150% of the U.S. poverty level. And the decline in work effort has not been anything near the unsustainable level. So in that sense, basic income at 150% of the poverty line is affordable. In this other sense, some people don't, it costs more than they think it's worth. In that sense, it is unaffordable.
So were you saying that experiments have been run with basic income levels at 150% of what the median income is, and people who are receiving
No, 150% of the poverty line. If it was 100% of median income, it would not work.
Yeah, sorry. I don't know where I got that from. Okay, so 150% of the poverty line, and that recurring universal payment did not reduce the amount of hours those people were working as a comparison. So they were still working just as hard.
No, it did. It did reduce it, but it reduced primary workers. Primary workers worked. There's an average across the studies shows like 4.5% to 5% in average hours per week, and a broader range is like 2 to 7% across these various studies. But secondary workers reduce their work effort a little more than that. But and all of those all of those were and when they reduced their labor, generally it was children living in the household staying in school longer. It was parents, usually mothers, spending more time with children. Both of those things you could call work. We don't usually count anything that doesn't make money as work, but those are things that maybe we want people to be doing more of. So those are the first two factors. And the third factor was primary earners who, when they happen to become unemployed, so they lost their job or something, taking more time to find the right job. So the decline in labor effort was not very much, and it was not about people dropping out of the labor force. So we're a long way from finding that out. I'm sure from finding out how high basic income has to be. There is some level of basic income where that would happen, but how high it is, it's really higher than anybody is realistically proposing in the short run.
I think an unappreciated fact of like what would be a consequence of a universal basic income is that you do away with the need for a minimum wage, and businesses require, like, from what I've heard, starting a business and running a business and keeping that business alive over time is actually really, really tough. A lot of businesses go out of business within 1 or 2 years. So if you had a whole population of people who are getting a basic income, and a business could potentially afford to hire someone for just $5 an hour, and me as a free citizen, if I'm getting a basic income and my basic needs are cared for, and if let's say I've just started uni and I want to learn a lot of skills or whatever, I may be happy to take that $5 an hour, because I know that on top of that $5 an hour, I'm going to be acquiring lots of new skills and working on something that I'm really interested in. So I see it as, I actually see a universal basic income as pro-business and as sort of like an entrepreneur's allowance. Like, not only could it remove a lot of, I guess, the ails that are, the things that affect the most disadvantaged, but it could also dramatically improve our capacity to innovate and to tackle social change and to get people doing things that align with them the most.
Yeah. Well, I would say the most important thing about basic income and entrepreneurs is not the wage issue, but the fact that the entrepreneur has this cushion from the basic income. Imagine now, the analogy I like to say here for business owners is with trapeze artists. Okay, let's say trapeze. What you want to do with say you want to get your trapeze artist to do the fanciest, biggest, most interesting tricks. You want to get them to do that. Well, there's a lot of ways you can incentivize trapeze artists to do the big tricks. Maybe you pay them loads and loads of money. Pay them millions of dollars for doing these fancy, fancy tricks. That's kind of the way we're doing it now. That's one way to get them doing fancy tricks. Another way is use some of that money you were using to pay them to do the fancy tricks and use that to provide a net. Now, which trapeze artist is going to do the best tricks? The one with the net or the one that makes a lot of money when they do it? The net is really the most important thing to get people to take that leap. You get so many more people to take that leap if they have that cushion. And we're wasting so much talent because we don't let people start businesses unless they do menial jobs for people who already own businesses for years and years before they can save up their money. And I'm an example of it. My brother and I, when I started working in Qatar and got some decent income, where I had disposable income left over, my brother and I started a business where I invest the money. He buys houses, fixes them up, rents them out, and we own the business. He had to start part-time. He had to start part-time and stay longer part-time, mostly because in the United States, you've got to buy private insurance. And we couldn't afford to get him private insurance. Whereas he could have just, started off with it. If we had public health care and a basic income, we could have started that business a lot earlier. And who knows, how many more houses we could have fixed up and rented out and made real nice by now. But the idea of the wage thing that you brought up is important for businesses, but it's interesting what you would expect to happen with the wage. And there's some evidence of this from empirical studies. But if you have a basic income, what you expect is the wages for bad jobs are going to go up. People in meatpacking industries, people in food service, the lowlier parts of food service, the dishwashers, migrant laborers. Those kind of wages are going to go way up, and the working conditions are going to improve. But other jobs with a high advancement potential, where you can really learn things, wages might actually go down. And actually, we might need a minimum wage to protect those people from being really exploitive. It could be that your media mogul will always have a bunch of unpaid secretaries. Because, you'd be my secretary a few years. Maybe you move up in the business, maybe you don't. And they could just have this parade of people who want to break into the business. And that might become a little bit like he is taking advantage not only of his basic income, but everybody else's basic income. You might want to have something that, I don't know how big of a problem that would be, and if we should even worry about it, but it is a potential problem there for basic income. Yeah,
no, there are definitely other things to worry about before. I mean, they're all consequences of, they're good problems to have. If you know that your whole population, if you've effectively removed poverty, and you know that people are just, they no longer have this looming concern for security. So I know that we've been speaking for a decent amount of time now. Do you want to wrap up soon, like over the next 10 minutes or so?
Yeah, I guess we should do a wrap up. If you want to, we didn't get through like half of the topics you talked about. So if you want to do it again another time, we should do it when I'm in Doha, so the time change is smaller. But if you want to do it another time and take off where we left off, I'll be happy to talk more. But yeah, you're right. We should be wrapping up about now.
Yep. Okay. Well, yeah. There's just so. I mean, it's not easy to cover the history of private property and of our conceptions of freedom, and then there's the whole discussion of universal basic income. So. So that sounds good. Picking up where we left off, or just booking in another one for some time. So if people want to find out where to keep up with your work, how to find out more about what you're up to, about universal basic income, I'm obviously going to link to all of your books and everything that we've discussed on the show notes. So they will be listed there, as well as, your Twitter profile. But where would you direct people?
Well, okay, I am very soon. I plan to launch Widerquist.com. It is. I've actually owned Widerquist.com for 20 years, but my family, my brother and I were using it. But then we just kind of. It was hard to do websites back then, and we kind of let it fall away. Now I have a research assistant helping me out, getting my research on Widerquist.com. That's going to launch really soon. And that's much easier to remember, because the other ways you got to search Widerquist selected works. That's where my research is. But Widerquist.com is going to be like a searchable way to find that. Also, you can look at my research YouTube channel. I actually have 2 YouTube channels. I have my personal one where I do my music and funny stuff. And then I have the research one where you have me giving speeches, giving interviews, and academic presentations and things like that. So just go to YouTube and search Karl Widerquist, and I'm sure search channels. And I'm sure those 2 channels will be the only thing that comes up when you search Karl with a K Widerquist. So those are the best ways to find my stuff.
Perfect. And I think we'll probably pick up this conversation in the future. But do you have any requests or things you'd like to say to the audience before we wrap up?
No, I'd like to thank you for this great opportunity to talk about this stuff in like some real depth. I appreciate that a lot. I'm glad you find an audience that likes this kind of in-depth stuff. That's fantastic to have.
Yeah, well, I know I do. So there's at least one more of me out there. So, and there is, so I've discovered. So it's nice. Alrighty, Karl. Thank you very much, and looking forward to continuing this conversation.
Great. Me too. Talk to you another time.